The noon train shrieked into Calico Flats like a wounded animal, and Simon Bishop stood at the far end of the platform with his hat pulled low, and his heart doing something it had no business doing, hammering. He had come to pick up a livestock order, or so he told himself during the 3-mile ride into town that morning. He had told the same thing to his ranch hand, Dewey Prout, who had grinned like a man who knew better, and said nothing worth arguing about. The truth was that Simon Bishop had been standing at this platform every Friday for the past 6 weeks, ever since he had received a letter from a woman in St. Louis, who had read his advertisement in the Farmer's Gazette. The advertisement had been modest, the kind a 40-year-old widower writes when he is embarrassed by his own loneliness and tries to disguise it as practicality. It had said something about a working ranch north of Calico Flats, good water, decent soil, a man who kept his word, and needed a capable woman to share the work. He had not mentioned that the ranch house still smelled faintly of his late wife Margaret's dried lavender, or that he still left her side of the bed unmade some mornings, because making it felt like erasing her. The woman who had written back called herself Clara Whitmore. She had written 3 letters in total, each one slightly warmer than the last, each one describing herself in careful, measured terms, 32 years old, experienced with household management, comfortable with animals, originally from Ohio. The letters were neat, almost too neat. Simon had read them beside his oil lamp and noticed that Clara Whitmore wrote like someone choosing every word with great deliberation, the way you do when you are afraid the real words might give something away. He had written back each time. He was not a man of poetry, but he was honest, and his letters said so. He told her about the dry summer they'd had and about the colt that had been born with a crooked foreleg and had since grown into the finest quarter horse on the property. He told her about his daughter, Nora, who was 17 and sharp as a tack and deeply suspicious of the whole arrangement. He told her what he expected and what he could offer, and he had asked in his last letter for a photograph. No photograph had arrived. Only a brief note saying she would be on the noon train on the 14th of September, 1883, and that he would recognize her because she would be wearing a green dress and carrying a blue traveling case. The 14th of September had come. The train exhaled a final cloud of steam, and the platform filled with the usual commotion, a cattle buyer in a brown suit, 2 soldiers heading south, a Mexican family with 4 children who tumbled off the steps like a litter of pups. Simon watched the car doors, methodical as always, and there she was. She wore a green dress. She carried a blue traveling case. She stepped down from the second passenger car with the careful deliberateness of someone navigating uncertain ground, and she stood for a moment on the platform's edge, scanning faces. She had dark hair pinned under a modest traveling hat, and her face was not what he had expected, though he could not have said what he had expected. She was not the prim, angular woman the careful letters had suggested. She was softer than that, and younger-looking somehow, with dark eyes that moved over the crowd with a watchfulness that reminded Simon of a deer at a watering hole alert, measuring exits. He knew her. That was the thing that knocked the breath clean out of him, and made no rational sense at all. He knew her the way you know the smell of rain before it arrives, the way you know a particular trail in the dark because your horse has walked it so many times that your body remembers. He had never laid eyes on this woman in his life, and yet something in him recognized her so completely and so suddenly that he actually lifted a hand and took a step forward before he had consciously decided to do either. She saw him. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with a rancher's weathered face and gray at his temples that was still working its way in from the edges. He was the only man on the platform who was looking at her as though he was looking for someone specific. Their eyes met and something happened in hers, a brief, startled flash like a lamp catching wind, and then it was gone and she composed herself. He crossed the platform to her. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and held out his hand. She took it. Her grip was firm, no hesitation, but she swallowed once before she spoke, and he noticed it. "Mr. Bishop," she said. Her voice was low and clear and nothing like the voice he had unconsciously assigned to her letters. It was fuller, with a slight roughness at the edges, as though she had been doing a great deal of talking lately or had been crying not long ago. He was not certain which. "Welcome to Calico Flats," he said. "The wagon's just up from the depot. I'll take that case." She let him take it. It was heavier than it looked, and as he lifted it he caught the faint scent of something unfamiliar, not perfume, not anything as deliberate as that. More like the ghost of cedar and dried herbs, something old and personal. They walked off the platform together, and Simon Bishop thought about the way her eyes had moved over the crowd, and the way she had swallowed before she spoke his name, and the way the name had not quite fit her mouth the way her own name would, and he said nothing about any of it because he was a patient man who believed that important things had a right to unfold at their own pace. The wagon ride north was quiet at first. Calico Flats fell away behind them, its single main street with the general store, and the saloon and the bank that had been robbed twice in 2 years, its dusty cross streets, and the church that sat on the slight rise at the north end with its white paint peeling in the September heat. Beyond the town the land opened up into the wide, tawny expanse of Colorado high plains, the mountains blue and distant in the west, the sky so enormous and so deeply blue that it felt like a physical weight above them. "It's bigger than I imagined," she said. "The sky or the land? Both." She looked west toward the mountains. "In the letters I described it to myself based on what you wrote, but I got it wrong." "Most people do," Simon said. "You can't really picture it until you're standing in it." She nodded slowly. She had her hands folded in her lap and she sat straight-backed on the wagon seat, not rigid but contained, like someone who had learned long ago to take up no more space than necessary. "I should tell you something," she said, after they had gone perhaps another mile. He waited. She drew a breath and looked at her hands. "My name is not Clara Whitmore." Simon kept his eyes on the trail and said nothing. "My real name is Edna Reed. Clara Whitmore she was a friend of mine. She answered your advertisement. She intended to come. She died of fever 6 weeks ago, 3 days before she was to depart, and she stopped, started again. I know that what I have done is dishonest. I know that you may want to turn this wagon around and put me on the return train, and I will not argue if that is what you decide. But I want to explain it to you if you will allow me." Simon turned the wagon around a long bend where a dry creek bed crossed the road, and a stand of cottonwoods grew in the richer soil along its edges, their leaves just beginning to turn in the early autumn. He guided the horses through the crossing without hurrying and then let them settle back into their walking pace before he spoke. "Go ahead," he said. Edna Reed looked at him with something that might have been relief or might have been the early stages of trust. She could not yet tell the difference. "Clara and I were friends since childhood," she said. "She had no family left, and I was the only one with her at the end. She made me promise, and I understand how strange this sounds. She made me promise to come in her place. She said she had read your letters and she believed you were a good man, and she did not want the advertisement and the correspondence to have been for nothing, and she knew about my situation." "What situation is that?" Edna was quiet for a moment. A hawk slid across the sky above them, riding a thermal, unbothered by human complications. "I was married," she said, "to a man in St. Louis named Gerald Reed. He died 14 months ago. He left behind more debt than I knew about, and the house was taken, and I had been working as a seamstress since then. It's honest work and I am not ashamed of it, but—" She paused. "There are men in that city who knew Gerald, who knew about the debts, who had particular ideas about how I might settle what they believed I owed them. I was not safe there, Mr. Bishop. Clara knew that. She thought this was a way out for me." Simon turned that over. He thought about the measured letters, about the way every word had been chosen carefully, about the watchfulness in Edna Reed's eyes on the platform. "She was not wrong that I needed to leave," Edna said. "But I know I have arrived here under false pretenses and you have every right to be angry. "I am not angry," Simon said. She looked at him. "You should be." "Maybe," he said, "but I am not." He let a beat pass. "I had a feeling, if I am being honest with you, something about those letters. They were right in what they said, but they did not quite feel like one person all the way through, like two people taking turns." Edna absorbed that. "Clara wrote the first letter," she said. "I helped her with the second two after she fell ill. She wanted you to know the ranch, to know Nora before she arrived. Then those words were partly yours." "Partly, yes." He nodded, very slightly, as though this confirmed something he had suspected. The horses plodded on, unhurried, and the mountain stayed blue in the west, and after a while Simon said, "My daughter Nora is 17 and she is not pleased about this arrangement. I want you to know that going in so it does not catch you off guard." "What did you tell her about me?" "That a woman named Clara Whitmore was coming to live at the ranch, that I had corresponded with her and found her to be a sensible person, and that I hoped they would get along." Nora said she hoped I had not lost my mind. Despite everything, Edna made a small sound that was almost a laugh. "She sounds formidable." "She is," Simon said, with a plainness that was also a kind of pride. "Looks like her mother, argues like her mother too, which means she wins more than is strictly comfortable." There was a warmth in the way he said it that told Edna something important about him. She filed it away. "I will tell Nora my real name," Edna said. "I want to be straight about it from the beginning." "That would be my preference too," Simon said. "In this house we deal in the truth even when it is inconvenient." She nodded. "Then there is one more thing I should tell you." He waited again. "I am not looking for a man to take care of me," she said. "I will work. I mean that. I am capable and I am not delicate and I will earn my keep and more. But I cannot agree to a marriage under false pretenses and then try to become someone I am not. If this is going to be anything real, it will have to start honest." Simon Bishop looked at her then, a long, direct look that she met without flinching. He saw the exhaustion and the determination and the grief that she was carrying, and he saw the steel underneath all of it, and he felt that inexplicable recognition again, only stronger now. "Edna Reed," he said, trying out the name. "All right," she exhaled. "We will tell Nora tonight," he said, "and we will take things as they come. No promises that cannot be kept." It was not romantic. It was nothing like the stories she had read as a girl. But it was honest, and honesty, Edna Reed had learned, was a far rarer and more valuable thing than romance. She looked west at the mountains and thought maybe. The Bishop Ranch sat on a broad plateau above a seasonal creek, surrounded on three sides by open grassland and back to the north by a line of ponderosa pines that broke the worst of the winter wind. The house itself was solid and unpretentious, 2 stories of timber and adobe with a wide covered porch, a kitchen garden that had gone to seed at the end of summer, a barn painted red that was fading to a comfortable rust, and 3 smaller outbuildings in varying states of repair. There were horses in the near pasture, 12 of them, quarter horses mostly, and a small herd of cattle visible on the far hillside. It was a working ranch in the truest sense, and Edna could see at a glance that it needed 2 pairs of hands. Nora Bishop was waiting on the porch. She was tall like her father, with light brown hair that she wore in a practical braid, and she had her father's direct gaze plus her own sharpness added on top of it, which made her eyes feel like they were reading small print at considerable distance. She wore a work dress and boots, and she had a look on her face that Edna could only describe as strategic neutrality. She had not decided anything yet, but she was gathering information at a rapid pace. "Papa," she said, coming down the porch steps. Her eyes moved to Edna. "Nora," Simon said, stepping down from the wagon, "there is something we need to talk about before anything else." He explained it briefly and without drama. Edna stood beside the wagon and did not try to soften it or explain it prematurely. She let Simon say what needed to be said, and then she stepped forward and met Nora's gaze directly. "I am Edna Reed," she said. "Your father has the right to put me back on that train tomorrow, and I will not argue it. But I came here in good faith, and I intend to be honest with both of you from here forward." Nora looked at her father. Something passed between them that was entirely their own language, the compressed communication of two people who had been each other's main company through considerable grief. "Can you cook?" Nora asked Edna. Edna blinked. "Yes. Well enough to feed 2 hired men and a man who eats enough for 3. I worked as a seamstress, not a cook, but I can learn what I don't know. Clara taught me her biscuit recipe." Nora considered this with the gravity of a judge. "Come inside," she said finally. "I made coffee." It was not a warm welcome, but it was a fair one, and Edna recognized it for what it was. The kitchen was large and functional, with a cast iron stove that dominated one wall and a long pine table that had taken a great many meals and showed it. Nora poured coffee with the efficiency of someone who had been running a household for some time, and Edna understood without being told that Nora had been managing this house since her mother died. How long ago, she did not yet know, but she could see it in the way Nora moved through the kitchen, authoritative and practiced. "How old were you when your mother passed?" Edna asked, wrapping her hands around the coffee cup. Nora glanced at her. 13. "So you have been keeping this house for 4 years?" "Yes." "I am not here to take that from you," Edna said. "I can take over the parts that are too much, and I can learn from you on the parts where you know better than I do. This is your home." Nora looked at her with an expression that was hard to read, part suspicion, part something softer. "You are not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect? A woman trying too hard?" "I am too tired to try too hard," Edna said honestly. "I have been trying too hard for 14 months and I am fresh out of performance." For just a moment, Nora Bishop smiled. It was quick and partly suppressed, but it was real, and Edna caught it like a match striking. The first week was a study in careful navigation. Edna slept in the small room off the main hall that had served as a sewing room, and she kept her things neat and her footprint small while she learned the rhythms of the place. She rose before dawn because Simon did, and she had coffee ready when he came in from the morning check of the horses, and she learned that he took it black, and that he read whatever newspaper was available even when it was 2 weeks old. She learned that Dewey Prout, the ranch hand, was a quiet man of 45 who had worked for Simon for 8 years, and who had the hands of a man twice his size and the gentleness of a man half his age with animals. She learned about the second hand, a young man named Jesse Calloway, 20 years old and red-haired and prone to monologues about the horses he admired and the ones he was less impressed by. She also learned that Simon Bishop was in the habit of working himself until his body simply refused to go further, that he ate quickly and without particular interest in food, and that he sat on the porch in the evenings with a pipe he rarely actually lit, looking west at the mountains with an expression that was not quite grief and not quite peace, but something shifting between the two. She did not press. She worked, as she had promised. She took over the kitchen garden, cutting back the dead growth and turning the soil under for next season, and she mended the household linens, which had been darned and redarned until they were more thread than original fabric, and she helped Nora with the canning that had been put off until the last of the summer vegetables were on the edge of going over. Nora watched her and tested her in small ways that Edna recognized as completely reasonable, and Edna answered each test honestly and without resentment. On the 4th morning, Simon came in to find that she had discovered a loose step on the back porch stairs and fixed it using tools she had found in the barn. He stood looking at the repair for a long moment. "Solid," he said. "My father was a carpenter," she said. "I grew up holding things steady while he worked. You learn by proximity." He looked at her with that quality of attention he had, which was not the lazy glance of a man who sees a woman as a type rather than a person. He saw her specifically. She found it unsettling in the best possible way. "Your father's not living?" he asked. "No, he died when I was 24. My mother followed him 2 years later." She kept her voice matter of fact. "I married Gerald the year after my father died. I was 25. He did not offer the customary condolences. He said, and he was not a good man to you." It was not a question. She had not told him anything of the sort, but he read it in the way she had described leaving St. Louis, not as escaping grief, but as escaping danger. He was not a bad man in the way that some men are bad, she said carefully. He was weak in the way that some men are weak. He borrowed money without telling me and made promises to people he should not have promised things to, and when he died the debts came to the door like creditors always do, which is to say all at once. How old are you, Edna? 31. I am 40, he said, in case that matters to you. It doesn't, she said, and she meant it plainly and without flattery. She had come to a place in her life where 9 years seemed like nothing at all against the question of whether a person was honest and decent and capable of genuine kindness. He nodded once and went back out to the horses. In the second week, she rode with him. It happened practically. One of the mares had wandered through a gap in the north fence, and Simon needed to cover the far pasture to find her, and Jessie Calloway was occupied mending the fence itself, and Dewey was in town for supplies. Nora could not go because she had driven herself to Calico Flats the previous day to attend the Thursday school meeting. She helped organize for the younger children in the district, and had twisted her ankle coming down the schoolhouse steps, and was currently established on the sitting room settle with her foot elevated, and her expression communicating that she was deeply annoyed about this. "I can ride," Edna said, "if you need an extra pair of eyes." Simon looked at her, measuring. "You ride?" "I grew up in Ohio. My father kept 2 horses. I have not ridden in some time, but muscle memory is long." He saddled the gray mare he used as a spare, and she swung up without difficulty and settled herself with the quiet competence of someone who had once done this daily. He watched this without comment and then led them north along the fence line. The morning was cool and bright, the sky washed clean from a rain 2 nights before, the mountains very sharp and very blue. The grass was tawny with the season turning, and the aspens on the higher slopes had gone full gold. It was the kind of morning that made the West comprehensible, that made the hardship and the isolation feel like a reasonable price for something this large and this beautiful. They found the mare in a draw about 2 miles north, helping herself to the last of the season's grass in a low spot where the soil held more moisture. Simon went around to the left and Edna moved right without being told, and together they cut the mare back toward the fence line with the ease of 2 people who had worked together much longer than 2 weeks. It was a small thing. It nonetheless felt significant to both of them, though neither said so. On the way back, with the mare on a lead rope, they rode side by side on the wider parts of the trail, and Edna told him about the time her father's horse had escaped the paddock and had been found 3 miles away, calmly eating someone else's kitchen garden, and she made the story funny without trying to be funny, which was a gift he recognized as rare. He told her about the time Dewey had attempted to gentle an unbroken stallion using a method he had read about in an agricultural pamphlet, and had ended up sitting in the water trough because it had been the nearest landing surface. And Edna laughed, a genuine and unguarded laugh that startled a bird out of a nearby shrub and made Simon's chest feel peculiarly full. He had not laughed with a woman in 4 years. He had not realized how much of ordinary life was braced against the absence of it. That evening on the porch, he actually lit the pipe. Nora watched from inside through the window, her ankle still elevated, and allowed herself a small and private opinion. In the 3rd week, Calico Flats introduced itself with its full complement of complications. Edna went into town with Dewey on the supply run, partly because she needed to pick up thread and several other personal necessities, and partly because she was developing a practical curiosity about the community that surrounded the ranch. Calico Flats was not a large town, perhaps 300 souls, maybe 400 if you counted the homesteaders in the surrounding district, but it had the density of human drama that all small, isolated towns develop when there is not enough space between people for their various stories to stay private. She was recognized at the general store not by name but by circumstance. The proprietor, A man named Harlan Fitch, who had the walrus mustache and the interested eyes of a man who traded in information as readily as he traded in goods, greeted her with excessive friendliness and asked, in a voice calibrated to carry, whether she was the woman who had come to stay at the Bishop place. "I am," she said evenly. "Some folks expected Clara Whitmore," he said. "Different name entirely, they say." She did not flinch. "Clara Whitmore was my friend. She passed before she could make the journey. My name is Edna Reed. I came in her place, and Mr. Bishop has been made fully aware of the circumstances." Harlan Fitch chewed on this like jerky. "Peculiar arrangement. I imagine it seems so from the outside," Edna said, with a pleasantness that committed to nothing. "I will take 3 spools of dark thread and a pound of the coffee, please." The woman standing at the other end of the counter was Mabel Croft, who was married to the bank manager, and who Edna would shortly learn was the primary engine of Calico Flats's social intelligence. Mabel Croft had a kind face that she had learned to deploy strategically, and she introduced herself with warmth that was genuine enough, but also clearly gathering material. "You must come to the Ladies' Aid Society meeting next Thursday," Mabel said. "We meet at the church. It is a wonderful way to meet people." "Thank you," Edna said, and meant it more than Mabel perhaps expected. She was lonely in the particular way that someone is lonely when they are surrounded by work and occupied from dawn to dark, but have no one to simply talk with, woman to woman, about the ordinary business of being a person. More immediately consequential was the encounter outside the general store, where a man leaned against the hitching post who looked at Edna with the kind of attention that had nothing friendly in it. He was a medium-sized man in a good coat, city cut, and he had a look that she had seen before, the look of a man accustomed to collecting things, including people, including debts. She did not recognize him, but she felt the recognition go the other direction, and it was like cold water down her spine. She kept her pace steady to the wagon where Dewey was loading, and she did not look back. "Dewey," she said quietly, setting her parcel in the wagon bed. "Do you know the man by the store?" Dark coat, brown hat. Dewey glanced with the practiced casualness of a man who had spent years not getting caught looking. "Nope," he said. "He's not from here. I'd know him. He was looking at me." Dewey looked at her now directly and with a different quality of attention. "Get up on the wagon," he said quietly. "We'll go." She did, and they went. And as Dewey guided the team through the main street and out toward the North Road, Edna sat with her hands still in her lap and her mind running through the possibilities like cards being turned over one by one. She had told Simon her real name. She had not told him the full story of St. Louis and what she had left behind, because she had not wanted to make herself into a problem in the first days when she was still proving she was not a burden. She was beginning to think this had been a tactical error. She told him that evening. She found him in the barn, checking a horse's hoof by lantern light, and she waited until he had set the hoof down and straightened up before she said, "I need to tell you about something. About why I left St. Louis, more specifically than I told you before." He took the lantern from the hook and faced her. She told him about the men Gerald had borrowed from. She told him that one of them in particular, a man named Burl Chesick, who operated in the gray space between legitimate lending and outright extortion, had made it clear after Gerald's death that Edna was expected to honor her late husband's obligation through whatever means were available to her, and that the means he had in mind were not ones she was willing to contemplate. She told him she had left St. Louis in genuine fear and under considerable urgency, and that the man outside the store today might have been coincidence, but that her instincts said otherwise. Simon stood with the lantern in his hand, and his expression was careful and still, the way still water is still, not inert but contained. "Did Chesick send men before you left?" he asked. "He came himself," she said. "Once. I told him there was nothing to discuss. He said I had not been listening carefully." She met Simon's eyes. "He did not touch me, but he was the kind of man who lets you understand what he could do without having to do it yet." I understood. Simon put the lantern back on the hook. "All right," he said. "I am sorry I did not tell you the full of it immediately," she said. "I should have." "You told me when you could," he said. "That is enough." A pause. "I will send word to the sheriff in the morning. Holt Greer, he is a fair man, and I will have Dewey and Jesse keep an eye on anyone unfamiliar in the area. I don't want to bring trouble to your land," she said, and she meant it with the full weight of her conscience behind it. "Edna," he said, and his voice was very steady and very quiet. "You are on my land now. Trouble that comes after you comes to me, and I have dealt with trouble before. That is not a complaint. That is just how it is." She looked at him in the barn lantern's warm light, and she thought about the word now, and the way he had said it, "on my land now," not like ownership but like inclusion, like the drawing of a circle that had a place in it for her. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and went back to his work, and she went back to the house, and in the kitchen she stood for a moment with her hand flat on the pine table, steadying herself, and thought that the thing happening in her chest had no business happening this soon and in these circumstances, and could not seem to help itself regardless. The man in the dark coat appeared again 4 days later. He came up the ranch road in the early afternoon, while Simon was out in the far pasture with Jesse and Dewey, and Nora was at her Thursday school meeting in town. Edna was alone in the kitchen garden, turning over the last of the season's beds, and she heard the horse before she saw the rider. She stood up and faced him without running, because she had decided in the 4 days since the general store that she was done running, and also because the pitchfork in her hand was a practical comfort. It was not the man from the store. It was a different man, older, leaner, with a courier's practicality in the way he sat his horse. He pulled up at the garden fence and looked down at her. "You Edna Reed," he said. "Who is asking?" "Got a letter for a woman by that name. Fella in town paid me to deliver it." He held out an envelope. She crossed the garden and took it without touching his hand. The envelope had her name written in an unfamiliar hand, and below it, in smaller letters, the words "Courtesy of B. Chesick." The courier tipped his hat and rode back down the road without waiting for a response. She took the letter inside and opened it at the kitchen table. It was brief. It said that Burl Chesick was aware of her location and wished only to discuss the settlement of the outstanding matter, and that he had a representative in the area who would be glad to arrange a meeting at her earliest convenience. It said, in its final line, that he hoped she understood that his patience had always been finite. She folded it precisely and set it on the table. Then she picked up her shawl and walked out across the pasture toward the far field, where she could see the distant shapes of the men working. She walked with intention, covering ground efficiently, and when Simon looked up and saw her coming, he read something in her posture across a 1/4 mile of grass that made him leave what he was doing and meet her halfway. She handed him the letter. He read it. His face changed in a way that was not anger exactly. It was more contained than anger, more directed, like a river when it gets narrow and the water moves faster. "He has a man in Calico Flats," he said. "The man I saw outside the store. Likely." He folded the letter. "I am going to ride in and speak with Holt Greer today, this afternoon. I will come with you." He looked at her. "You don't have to." "Chesick is my problem," she said. "I will not sit in the house while other people handle my problem." He studied her for a moment and said, "All right. We will go after I finish the fencing, which will be another hour." She nodded and stood beside him and watched the field work for that hour, not because she had to, but because she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not want to be away from him. Holt Greer, the sheriff of Calico Flats, was a lean man of 50 with a gray beard and the unhurried manner of someone who had seen enough that nothing much surprised him. He read the letter carefully and asked Edna precise questions about Chesick and the men he had employed in St. Louis, and she answered all of them with the specificity that she had been storing up since the day she had walked out of that city. "I can wire the St. Louis Marshal's office," Greer said. "Get a clear picture of this Chesick, and I will have a conversation with the man who has been loitering in my town." He folded his hands on the desk. "Mrs. Reed, you are on Bishop land, which is in my jurisdiction." Anyone who wants to harass you will have to come through proper channels or they will have to deal with me directly, and I am not a man who enjoys being inconvenienced." It was said without dramatics, with the flat certainty of a man who meant what he said. Outside the sheriff's office, in the fading afternoon light, Edna stood beside the wagon and felt something unknot in her chest that had been knotted since she'd walked out of St. Louis with one traveling case and Clara Whitmore's name. "Better?" Simon asked. "Better," she said. He helped her up into the wagon, his hand briefly at her elbow, a natural and practical gesture, and yet she was aware of it with a completeness that was entirely disproportionate to so small a contact. They ate supper with Nora that evening, all three of them at the long pine table, and Edna told Nora the full of it, the letter Chesapeake, the sheriff's involvement, and Nora listened with her chin up and her eyes sharp and then said, "Then we will need to be careful for a while." "Yes," Edna said. "Good," Nora said and passed the bread. "We are capable of careful." And with that efficient declaration, the matter was absorbed into the life of the ranch. Not forgotten but incorporated, the way weather is incorporated, something to account for and manage rather than something to collapse under. That night after Nora had gone to bed, Edna sat on the porch in the dark with her shawl pulled close, and she could hear Simon moving in the barn, doing the last checks of the evening. The sky above the plains was extraordinary. The Milky Way spread out in a broad smear of cold light that she had never seen this clearly in any city, and the September air smelled of pine from the north stand and dry grass and the wood smoke from the kitchen chimney. Simon came out of the barn and saw her, and came to sit in the other chair without being invited, and without requiring an invitation. They sat without talking for a long time, and it was the most comfortable silence Edna Reed had inhabited in years. "Were you happy?" she asked eventually, before. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "Margaret and I, yes, we were happy. It was a working happiness, not a romantic one. We built something together and we knew what it was worth." "When did she die?" 4 years ago, November. Fever took her faster than anyone expected." A pause. "Nora found her in the morning. I was out on the range." Another pause. "I did not get back in time." The weight in those words was something he did not explain further, and Edna did not press, but she understood that he had been carrying that particular stone for 4 years and that it had shaped the way he moved through the world. "I am sorry," she said, simply. "She would have liked you," he said, which surprised them both into a moment of silence. He sounded faintly surprised at himself. "I mean, she had no patience for performance. She would have respected the directness." "That is a generous thing to say." "It is a true thing," he said. "I don't say things for generosity. I say them because they are accurate." She looked at his profile in the dark, the strong line of jaw, the gray at his temples catching the faint starlight, and she thought, "This is a good man. Not a perfect man, not a simple man, but a genuinely good one." And she thought about how rare that was and how much she had needed to find it. "I did not come here to fall into anything," she said carefully. "I want you to know that. I came because I needed a safe place and because Clara wanted me to, and because I had been running and I was tired of running. I did not come with a scheme." "I know that," he said. "But I also want to be honest," she said, "because honesty is what I promised you, and so I find that I am not indifferent to you, and I was not expecting that, and I am not sure what to do with it, but there it is." The night was very still. A coyote called far off to the east, and another answered it from somewhere in the pine stand. "You have been here 3 weeks," he said. "I know. 3 weeks is not a long time." "I know that too." She looked at the stars. "But 3 weeks in a small space with a person is more time than 3 years of passing someone on the street. You learn the important things quickly when you are living alongside them." He considered this. "What have you learned?" "That you are patient but not passive, that you love your daughter with everything you have, that you work more than is good for you, that you are honest to a degree that people find inconvenient sometimes, but that I find it entirely refreshing." She turned and looked at him directly. "That you saw me on that platform and knew there was something wrong and said nothing about it for 50 miles because you were giving me time to say it myself." He looked back at her. In the dark, in the starlight, his expression was open in a way she had not yet seen. "What I have learned," he said slowly, "is that the recognition I felt when you stepped off that train was not my imagination. I have been a practical man my whole life, and I have learned to trust the reliable things. But I am also standing here thinking that some things are reliable in ways you cannot measure with a fence post or a water gauge." She did not say anything because there was nothing to say to that which would improve it. He said, "I am not going to rush anything. That would not be right for either of us." "I agree," she said. "But I am also not going to pretend I am indifferent," he said, "because I am not." They sat in the dark with that between them, comfortable and warm as a fire. And after a while they said good night and went inside. And Edna lay in the small room off the main hall and looked at the ceiling and felt, for the first time in 14 months, not afraid. Burl Cheswick's man in Calico Flats was named Dennis Hoare, and Sheriff Holt Greer had a conversation with him the morning after Simon and Edna's visit that was, by the sheriff's later account, productive in the sense that it left no ambiguity about Hoare's welcome in the county. Hoare left on the southbound stage that same afternoon, which was a satisfying piece of efficiency. The Wire 2 cent. Louis came back within the week, with information that Greer brought out to the ranch himself on a gray October morning. He tied his horse at the post and came up to the porch where Edna and Simon both happened to be, and he stood with his hat in his hand, and said that the St. Louis Marshal's office had been building a case against Cheswick for some time on charges relating to unlawful coercion and several other matters, and that Edna's account of her situation had been forwarded and incorporated into that case, and that Cheswick was currently very occupied with his own legal difficulties, which made it unlikely he would be sending any further representatives to Colorado. Edna sat very still on the porch step for a moment. Then she let out a breath that seemed to come from a very deep place. "It's done," she said. "Far as you're concerned," Greer said. "I would not go back to St. Louis any time soon, but I don't expect he'll be coming to you again." She looked at Simon, who was leaning against the porch post with his arms crossed and his expression one of quiet, settled satisfaction. "Thank you, Holt," he said. "Bishop," the sheriff said with a nod, and put his hat back on and rode back down to town. Edna sat on the porch step in the October sunlight and felt the last of the weight lift off her shoulders, not all at once but gradually, like snow melting under an unexpected warm spell. She had been carrying it so long she had stopped feeling the full mass of it, and now its absence was almost disorienting. She felt lighter and also somehow more real, as though her own edges had been slightly blurred by the fear and were now coming back into focus. Simon sat down on the step beside her. Their shoulders were not quite touching. "Edna," he said. "I know," she said. "I will stay, if that is what you are going to ask." He was quiet for a moment. "I was going to say that I was glad you were safe." "Oh," she said. "Well, I am glad of that too." A pause. "And I will stay." He made a sound that was very nearly a laugh. "All right." October settled over the Bishop Ranch in amber and gold, and the particular blue of high Colorado skies that seemed to deepen as the season turned. The aspens on the higher slopes blazed for 2 weeks and then let go all at once, the leaves drifting down in a single generous gesture, and the mornings came hard and cold, ice on the water troughs that had to be broken before the horses could drink. Edna settled into the life of the ranch with a thoroughness that surprised her and seemed to satisfy everyone else. She took over the household accounts, which were kept in a battered ledger that Simon maintained with accuracy but without organization, and she brought a system to them that made the quarterly reckoning considerably less agonizing. She helped Nora with the preserved goods and the winter preparations, and she learned from Dewey how to check the cattle for the signs of illness that the season brought, and she rode with Simon twice a week on the range checks that were necessary as the weather turned. Nora thawed. It happened slowly and then all at once, which is the way of 17-year-olds who have decided to trust someone. There was a morning in mid-October when Edna was in the kitchen making bread and Nora came in from outside looking raw-eyed, and Edna did not ask immediately but put the kettle on and let Nora sit. And eventually, Nora said that there was a boy in town, the son of the blacksmith, Thomas Cole, who had been paying her attention, and that she did not know what to make of it and had no one to talk to about it because her father was her father, and he could not be expected to understand. Edna sat down across from her with 2 cups of tea and talked to her for an hour, not telling her what to do but helping her think through what she wanted and what she valued, and Nora listened with the focus that she brought to everything, and at the end of it she said with some surprise, "You are quite good at this." "My mother was good at it," Edna said. "I learned from her." "I miss my mother," Nora said, not with self-pity but as a plain statement of fact. "I know," Edna said. "I will not try to be her, but I am here if that is useful." Nora wrapped her hands around her cup and said nothing for a moment, and then she said, "It is useful," and that was enough. Simon saw the change between them. He said nothing about it directly, because he was a man who understood that some things grow better without commentary. But Edna caught him watching them at the supper table one evening with an expression that was so unguarded and so warm that she had to look away because the feeling it provoked in her chest was too large for a supper table. There was an evening in late October when they danced. This was not his idea or hers. It was Jesse Calloway's fault, entirely. Jesse had a fiddle, which he played with more enthusiasm than precision, but with enough rhythm to compensate. And on the Saturday evening after the fall cattle sale in town, which had gone well enough that Simon declared a small celebration was warranted, Jesse played in the kitchen while Dewey kept time on the table with a spoon, and Nora pulled Edna up to dance the way young people do, certain that dancing is something everyone wants to be doing. They danced together first, Edna and Nora, in the practical space between the table and the stove, and then Nora planted her hands on her hips and looked at her father and said, "Papa, it is impolite to watch." Simon Bishop looked alarmed in a way that he immediately controlled, and Edna laughed and held out her hand to him with the same simplicity with which she did everything, and he took it. He was not a natural dancer, and he did not pretend to be. He was a man who moved well in practical contexts on horseback, through work, but formal dancing had never been his domain. He said so in the first few steps, and she said it did not matter, and they found their way to something workable, not elegant but genuine. And Jessie played something with a little more pace, and they laughed at their own clumsiness. And Nora watched with her arms folded, and her face entirely failing to conceal how pleased she was. At some point the pace slowed, and the music drifted into something without a name, something Jessie was improvising, and they were closer than they had been, and Simon's hand at her waist was more real than anything had felt in a very long time, and she looked up at him and found him already looking at her, his expression complicated and clear at once. "Edna," he said very quietly so only she could hear. "Yes," she said, which was not quite an answer to something he had not quite asked, but answered it all the same. Jesse let the music trail off with a flourish and declared his hands needed a rest, and the moment passed without requiring any further navigation, and they sat back at the table and drank the cider that Dewey had produced from somewhere, and talked about the cattle market, and the coming winter, and whether the roof on the barn needed attention before the first snow. And it was entirely ordinary, and Edna thought that ordinary with this man was better than extraordinary had ever been with anyone else. November came hard and cold and necessary, the kind of cold that makes the inside of a house feel like a gift. Edna made the kitchen a warm place with consistent purpose. There was always something on the stove, always coffee available, always the smell of something that made the outside cold feel like a contrast rather than a threat. She had learned Simon's preferences and Nora's, and she cooked with the practicality of someone who had learned to make good food from limited ingredients, and suppers became the center of the day, the place where the work was set aside and they were simply people together. She and Simon talked in the evenings, after Nora went to bed. This became a habit without either of them deciding to make it a habit. He would come inside from the last barn check, and she would be at the table with her mending or her reading, and he would pour 2 cups of coffee without asking and sit across from her, and they would talk about everything. About his years on this land, about the early days when he and Margaret had built the house with their own hands and the hands of 2 neighbors, about the county's history, about the political situation in Denver and what it meant for the territory, about the books she had brought in her traveling case, a slim volume of poetry that she apologized for being impractical, and he said it was not impractical, and read a poem aloud from it in the rough, unpracticed way of someone not accustomed to reading aloud. And the sincerity of it was so complete that she could not speak for a moment after. He asked her about her childhood in Ohio, and she told him about the town and her father's workshop and the smell of sawdust and linseed oil, and about her mother's kitchen garden and the way the seasons moved through the Ohio landscape. He listened with his full attention, the way he listened to everything, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually taking in what she said and thinking about it. "You loved Ohio," he said. "I loved the person I was there," she said. "Before I became the person who married badly and then had to run. That person is still you," he said. "She just has more in her now." She looked at him across the table in the lamplight. "You say things like that so simply," she said, "as though they cost you nothing." "They cost me choosing the right words," he said, "which I am not always good at." A pause. "But I want to be with you." The first snow fell on the 12th of November, and it was not tentative. It came in from the north as a genuine early winter storm, 2 feet in the first night, the world entirely white and entirely silent by morning. The ranch hunkered down as ranches do, the animals brought into the barn, the work shifting to close quarters and careful patience. On the second day of the storm, when it was clear they would not be going anywhere for at least another day, and the house was sealed warmly against the cold, and Nora had retired to her room with a book, Simon Bishop came into the kitchen where Edna was making soup and stood in the doorway for a moment before she turned and saw him. "Something wrong?" she asked. "No," he said. "Nothing wrong." He came into the kitchen and leaned against the counter beside the stove, close enough that she was aware of his warmth alongside the stove's warmth, and he said, "I have been thinking." "About what?" "About what this is," he said. "You and I, what this is becoming." She set the wooden spoon down on the rest beside the pot and turned to face him. The snow was still falling outside the kitchen window, steady and thick, and the house was completely quiet. "And," she said, "I am not a man who does things part way," he said. "I never have been. I do not know how to be interested in something and then hold back from it indefinitely out of caution." He looked at her steadily. "I am interested in you in a way that is not about practicality or the ranch or any arrangement. I am interested in Edna Reed specifically, as the woman she actually is, which is the most specific and most peculiar and most entirely herself woman I have met in a very long time. And I would like to know if you are willing to see whether this becomes what I think it might become." She heard all of this carefully, which she could do because he said it slowly and without evasion. "Simon," she said, "I came here wearing someone else's name and someone else's story, and I was so afraid that I had already decided this would not work, and I was already planning what I would do after it inevitably failed. I had already decided to be ready for the exit." "And now," he said. She looked at him. She thought about the platform, about those dark eyes of his finding her in the crowd before she had found him, about the wagon ride and his patience and the horse in the northern draw and the dancing in the kitchen and every evening at this table with its coffee and its lamplight and its long, unrushed honesty. "Now I am not looking for the exit anymore," she said. He reached out and took her hand from where it rested on the counter, and he held it between both of his, and he said nothing, which was entirely right, and they stood in the kitchen with the soup simmering, and the snow falling and the fire in the stove making its steady sound. And it was not a declaration or a beginning or an ending, but simply a truth being acknowledged between 2 people who had both learned enough about loss to be careful with what they still had. He kissed her then, simply and without drama, in the way of a man who does not perform tenderness but means it, and she kissed him back with everything she was, the Ohio girl and the seamstress widow, and the woman who had stepped off a noon train in a green dress with someone else's name and been known anyway. Every version of her at once, unhidden. Outside, the snow kept falling, patient and unhurried, covering the world in white. December unfolded slowly, and with a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. Simon Bishop, who had learned to live on reduced allowances of hope, found himself extravagant with it in ways that surprised him. He caught himself looking for excuses to be in the same room with Edna, and then stopped looking for excuses, because there turned out to be no need for them. They worked alongside each other easily, their habits already so synchronized that the Prout once said, to Jesse's great amusement, that it looked like they had been doing this for 10 years. Nora, for her part, became something that Edna would privately describe as a gift she had not anticipated. The girl was intelligent and opinionated, and occasionally exhausting in the way that extremely bright young people are when they are still learning how to manage the weight of their own minds. And she and Edna developed the kind of friendship that exists between women of different generations who genuinely respect each other, which is rarer and more valuable than most things. Nora also told Edna about Thomas Cole, and the fact that he had presented himself at the ranch one Sunday in early December, ostensibly to discuss a mule that needed shoeing, but actually to spend 20 minutes in the yard pretending not to look at Nora, while Nora pretended not to look at him. Simon had watched this performance with the expression of a man who understood exactly what was happening and was bracing himself for the complications it represented. Edna had watched it with the expression of a woman who found it entirely charming. "He seems earnest," Edna told Nora afterward. "He is entirely too earnest," Nora said, in a tone that communicated she found this a great virtue. "You might invite him to supper," Edna suggested. "I cannot invite a man to supper," Nora said, scandalized. "Your father could invite him. The result would be the same." Nora considered this with the strategy she brought to everything. "You could suggest it to Papa." "I could," Edna agreed. "But you should." Nora did, and Thomas Cole came to Sunday supper the following week, and he was earnest and red in the face about it and clearly trying very hard, and Simon watched him with the flat, steady attention of a father measuring intentions, and the evening was mildly excruciating for Thomas and quite entertaining for everyone else. Simon said afterward that the boy had a decent handshake and seemed to know his own mind, which was high praise from a man of few words. Christmas came to the ranch with all the practical domesticity that Edna had begun to love. There were no grand gestures, no extravagances, just the warm accumulation of small things. The tree that Simon and Jessie cut from the pine stand and installed in the sitting room. The decorations that Nora produced from a box that had been her mother's, which she offered to let Edna add to, and which Edna understood was an offering of significant weight. There was the making of the Christmas meal, which Edna threw herself into with the full depth of her capability, discovering in the process that she was a better cook than she had given herself credit for, because she was cooking for people she cared about, and that changed the nature of the endeavor entirely. On Christmas evening after supper, Simon gave her a gift. It was small and wrapped in brown paper, a pair of fine leather riding gloves, fitted to her hand with a precision that meant he had measured her glove from the barn without her seeing. "For the range checks," he said. She put them on right there at the table and flexed her fingers in them, and they were perfect, supple and warm, and she looked at him with a feeling so full it pressed against the backs of her eyes. "Thank you," she said. She had made him a book. This sounds modest, but was not. She had found an empty ledger in town and spent 3 weeks filling it with her careful hand. Every recipe she knew, organized by season, with notes in the margins about substitutions and variations and the stories behind them. On the first page she had written, "For Simon Bishop, who made room for me." She had not shown it to anyone before giving it to him. He read the first page standing at the table and then sat down and turned several more pages slowly and did not look up for a long time. When he did, His expression was the open one, the one she had first seen by starlight on the porch, and he said nothing at all, which said everything. Nora watched this exchange from across the table and made no comment except to quietly refill everyone's coffee, which was her way of blessing something without being sentimental about it. January came in brutal and efficient, the way Colorado Januaries do, and there was a week in the middle of the month where the temperature dropped low enough that frost built up on the inside of the windows, and every job outside was twice as hard and half as possible. Simon worked in the cold with a matter-of-factness that Edna had come to understand was not stoicism, but faith, the faith of a man who had lived through enough seasons to know that severe cold ends, that February always comes, that the land's generosity was as dependable as its severity. She watched him from the kitchen window during those hard weeks and thought about the word home, which she had been very careful not to use because it seemed presumptuous. She had a room in his house and a place at his table and a growing claim on his mornings and evenings, but she had not called it home even in her own thoughts. She began, quietly, in January to call it home. He asked her to marry him in February. He did not make a production of it. This was very like him. He came in from the evening barn check on a cold February night and she was at the table with the account ledger and he sat down across from her and set his hat aside and he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it properly before you answer because I want your answer to be the true one." She set down her pen. "I would like you to marry me," he said. "Not as an arrangement, not for the practical matters, though they are there, and I am not going to pretend otherwise because you would see through it. I would like to marry you because I love you, Edna Reed, and that is a thing I did not expect to say again, and I mean it fully." The February wind was at the windows and the fire was low and needed banking, and the oil lamp was burning steadily between them, and she looked at Simon Bishop across that table where they had had so many evenings of coffee and honesty and the gradual, unguarded building of something real. "I love you too," she said. "Yes." He let out a breath. She realized he had been more nervous about it than his calm expression had shown and found this entirely endearing. "Yes," he said. "Simon," she said, with a warmth that was also mild exasperation. "Yes." He smiled then, fully, without reservation, and it was the first time she had seen that, the smile with nothing held back, and it remade his face in a way that was so fine she felt her own face do something she could not control. He came around the table and she stood and he pulled her close and they held each other in the lamplight, and the wind was at the windows, and the fire needed banking, and neither of them moved for a long time. They told Nora at breakfast the next morning. Nora looked at her father, then at Edna, then back at her father, and then she said, "It took you long enough," and went back to her biscuit. And Simon looked at Edna with an expression of amused helplessness that was very nearly the most attractive thing she had ever seen. The wedding was held in March, when the worst of the winter had broken and the land was in the first reluctant thaw. It was a small affair, the church in Calico Flats, a Thursday morning because that was when Reverend Marsh was available, and they did not see the point in waiting for a Sunday. The guests were Dewey and Jessie, Mabel Croft and her husband from the Ladies' Aid Society, Sheriff Greer and Nora, who stood up beside Edna with a solemnity that she would occasionally be teased about for years afterward. Edna wore a dress that she had made herself over the winter, deep blue with white at the collar, nothing extravagant, entirely her. She carried no flowers because it was March and the world outside was still mostly brown, but Nora had found 3 early crocuses in the south-facing yard that morning and tucked them into Edna's hair and said nothing about it, which meant everything. Simon stood at the front of that small church in his good coat with his hat in his hands, and when she came down the aisle he looked at her with the steady, specific recognition that had first knocked the breath out of him on the platform 6 months before, only deeper now, full of everything those 6 months had built between them. Reverend Marsh read the words and they spoke their own. Simon said, "I take you, Edna, as you are, everything you have been and everything you will be, with full knowledge and full choice and no reservations. Edna said, "I take you, Simon, as you are patient and honest and good in the ways that matter, and I came to this place wearing someone else's name and you saw through it to me, and I will spend whatever years we have being grateful that you looked." Reverend Marsh said amen, and the gathered company repeated it, and in the front pew Mabel Croft wept enthusiastically, and Dewey Prout stared at the ceiling with the expression of a man concentrating very hard on not being moved, and Jessie Calloway was moved and did not care who saw it, and Nora Bishop sat with her hands folded and her eyes clear and bright with something that was both loss and gain at once, as the best moments in life tend to be. Simon kissed his wife, simply and completely, in front of God and Reverend Marsh and Mabel Croft, and the high Colorado sky outside the church windows. Edna Reed became Edna Bishop on a Thursday in March of 1884, in a church in Calico Flats, Colorado, and the name fit her the way a well-made glove fits, precisely and naturally, and as though it had been waiting. Spring came to the Bishop Ranch with the generosity of a season that has been withheld too long. The creek ran full and clear with snowmelt, and the horses went out to pasture and moved through the new grass with the extravagance of creatures who have been cooped up all winter. The kitchen garden came back. Edna had prepared the beds in fall and the soil was ready, and she planted with a thoroughness that Nora observed and then joined, working beside her in the April sun. And between the two of them they put in twice what the garden had grown in previous years. Edna rode with Simon in the mornings with the frequency that the ranch work allowed, and he taught her the land, not just the geography of it but its personality, its wet places and its dry ones, the spots where the grass was sweetest, the draws where cattle liked to shelter from the wind, the high places from which you could see the whole of the plateau spread out below and the mountains beyond it. Enduring and enormous and completely indifferent to human ambition, in a way that Edna had come to find deeply comforting. She wrote a letter to St. Louis, not to anyone connected to Gerald or the debts, which had long since ceased to be her concern, but to a woman named Florence Hale who had been a neighbor in her seamstress years, a practical and warm woman who had been one of the few people genuinely sorry to see Edna leave. She told Florence what had happened, the full of it, in the direct way she had learned from Simon's example, and she said that she was married and settled and safe, and that the West was larger than she had imagined and more demanding and more beautiful, and that she was, to her own continuing surprise, genuinely and specifically happy. Florence wrote back a month later with congratulations and a recipe for a particular kind of apple cake that she had known Edna admired, and the letter also mentioned, in passing, that Burl Chesick had been indicted in St. Louis in April on 3 counts of unlawful coercion and 1 count of fraud, and that the trial was expected to be extensive. Edna read this to Simon at the table, and they sat with it for a moment, and then agreed that it was thoroughly satisfying news and had a second cup of coffee to mark the occasion. Nora graduated from the local school that spring with a performance that impressed everyone and surprised no one who knew her. She had decided, with the quiet certainty she brought to all her decisions, that she wanted to study further. The nearest institution of any quality was in Denver, which was not close but was reachable, and this was the subject of a family conversation in May that lasted an entire Sunday evening and was characterized by Nora's precision, Simon's measured concern, and Edna's practical problem-solving. By the end of the evening they had a plan. Nora would go to Denver in the autumn to enroll in the normal school, which trained teachers she wanted to teach, she said, and she had the temperament for it, which was a temperament that combined high standards with genuine interest in how people learned. Simon would cover the costs from the cattle income, which was sound this year. She would board with a family that Mabel Croft's cousin knew, and she would come home for Christmas. Nora, who had been managing a house and arguing her point since she was 13, was steady about it until the moment the plan was fully agreed upon, And then she went upstairs very quickly, and Edna gave it 10 minutes and then followed her. She knocked on the door and Nora let her in, and she was not crying quite, but her eyes were bright and her composure was doing its best. "I am excited," Nora said. "I am." "You are allowed to be both things at once," Edna said. "I have never gone anywhere," Nora said. "Not really." A pause. "What if I am not ready for it?" "You are," Edna said. "But more importantly, if you find parts of it that are harder than expected, you will handle them, because that is what you do." Nora sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands. "You did not know me 6 months ago, and now you know me better than most people do." "You let me know you," Edna said. "That was your choice." "I trusted you," Nora said, with the plainness that she had inherited from her father. "I thought you were worth trusting." "I hope I have been," Edna said. "You have," Nora said simply. And then, with only a slightly self-conscious pause, "It's good, that you and Papa, it's good." Edna sat beside her and put an arm around her shoulders, and Nora allowed it, and they sat for a few minutes in the evening quiet of the upstairs room. Summer came in, and the ranch work increased with the heat and the length of the days, and Edna found her pace in it. Not the frantic pace of someone proving themselves, but the steady, efficient pace of someone who knows their place and their value, and is not working to demonstrate anything to anyone. She could rope a fence post and track a sick calf and keep the accounts and make a meal from what was available and read poetry aloud on the porch in the evenings. And she did all of these things as parts of the same continuous life, rather than as separate performances. She and Simon moved through the days in the particular harmony of two people who have chosen each other carefully, and then kept choosing each other in the small daily ways that are the actual substance of a long love. He brought her the first late-season wildflowers he found on the range, not in a formal bunch, but just the stems in his hand, offered with directness and without ceremony, which was entirely more moving than ceremony would have been. She kept the account ledger with a care that freed him from a task he had never enjoyed, and gave him back hours for the outdoor work he loved. He built a shelf in the small room that was now their room together, for her books, which had grown from the slim volume of poetry to a modest collection that Mabel Croft's Ladies' Aid Society had contributed to with considerable generosity. She added a fourth chair to the kitchen table without consulting him, and explained when he noticed that it was for guests, and he said that it made sense, and it did. In September, on the 1-year anniversary of the day she had stepped off the noon train, Simon saddled 2 horses before dawn and did not tell her where they were going, and she did not ask, because she had learned to trust his direction the way she trusted the trail. She did not need to see ahead to believe it was good. He took her to the high place above the far pasture, the highest point on the ranch, where the plateau lifted into a shoulder of rock and the whole of the land spread below, and the mountains stood in their full September grandeur to the west, and they sat on their horses in the morning light and watched the sun come up over the eastern plains and turn the world gold and amber. 1 year, he said. 1 year, she said. From that noon train, he said. You knew me, she said, when I got off that train. You knew me before I'd said a word. I did, he said. I don't understand it, I don't need to. She looked at him in the morning light, this man who had stood at a platform with a livestock order as his excuse and a heart doing something complicated. This patient and honest and entirely good man who had given her his land and his name and his evenings and his specific, unhurried, complete attention. I knew you too, she said. I just didn't know I was allowed to. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, gloved in the Christmas leather, warm and steady. They watched the sun continue its slow ascent over the Colorado plains, and the mountains did what they always did, which was to stand there being mountains, enormous and permanent and indifferent, and somehow this was the greatest comfort in the world. They rode back to the ranch in time for breakfast, and Jesse had already started the coffee because Jesse was a man of excellent instincts, and Dewey had fed the horses, and everything was in motion with the particular cheerful efficiency of a working morning. Edna stood at the stove and made the biscuits, Clara's recipe, which she had made enough times now that her hands knew it from memory, And she thought about Clara Whitmore, who she had been, what she had hoped for in those careful letters, the brave and generous decision she had made at the end of her life to give her best chance to her best friend. She thought about this with the complicated tenderness that the living feel for those who have given them forward, and she said a private good morning to Clara in her heart, as she did most mornings, and she made the biscuits with her particular skill and set them on the table for the people she loved. "These are remarkable," Jesse said with his mouth full. "Thank you, Jesse," she said. "Close your mouth when you chew." "Yes, ma'am," he said, cheerfully unabashed. Nora left for Denver in October on the same depot platform from which Edna had arrived 13 months before. The morning was cold and bright, the sky that deep October blue, and Simon stood with the truck of Nora's luggage and looked stoically into the distance while Nora said goodbye to Dewey and Jesse, and Edna stood beside him and put her hand in his and he gripped it. Nora came to them last. She hugged her father first long and tight, and he held her with the same intensity and said into her hair something that Edna could not hear and which was entirely private. Then Nora turned to Edna. "Write to me," Nora said. "Every week," Edna said. "Tell me everything that happens on the ranch, the boring parts too." "All of it," Edna agreed. Nora looked at her with those sharp, clear eyes. "You belong here," she said. "I want you to know I know that." Edna felt the backs of her eyes burn and blinked it down and pulled Nora close and held her and said, "I know it too, because of you." The train came in on its schedule and Nora boarded it, and they stood on the platform and watched it carry her south toward Denver, and the platform was quiet and the mountains were blue in the west, and Simon put his arm around Edna's shoulders and she leaned into him, and they stood there until the train was entirely out of sight. Winter found the ranch quieter without Nora and warmer in other ways. They had the evenings to themselves entirely now, and they filled them differently than they had before, sometimes quietly, with reading and the fire, and sometimes in long conversation that ranged from the practical to the philosophical in the way that two people do when they have grown fully comfortable in each other's company. Simon started reading more, encouraged by Edna's books and her particular way of discussing what she read, and she found that he had incisive things to say about everything once he warmed to the habit of saying them. She discovered, in November, that she was expecting a child. She told him on a Tuesday morning in the kitchen, because that was where they always were in the mornings, and she had decided there was no reason to wait for a particular occasion. She simply said it, in the middle of pouring his coffee, and she watched his face go through something extraordinary shock, and then a joy so profound it seemed to move through his whole body, and then a look at her that was so tender and so serious at once that she had to set the coffee pot down because her hands were not entirely steady. "Edna," he said. "Spring," she said. "I think April." He came around the table and cupped her face in both his hands and looked at her with everything in him. And then he kissed her with the same completeness as that February night in the kitchen. And she held on to him and felt the particular quality of a life expanding, the way the land felt in spring when everything that had been held under by the cold began pushing through. They wrote to Nora immediately, and her letter back was emphatic with happiness and included several pages of very specific opinions about what the child should be taught first. The winter was good. They were busy and warm and full of the anticipation that a new life brings into a house, the practical preparations, and the particular quality of time that comes when something important is approaching. Edna knitted in the evenings with a focus that she had not previously applied to knitting, and Simon built a cradle in the barn on the weekends, carefully and without announcing what he was doing until it was done, and when he brought it into the house, it was the finest piece of carpentry she had ever seen from a man who claimed no skill at it. "You are full of hidden capabilities," she said. "My father built one for each of us," he said. "I wanted to remember how." A pause. "I thought about your father too, the carpenter." She looked at the cradle for a long time. Then she put her hand on it and felt the smooth grain of the wood under her palm and thought about her father and her mother and Clara, and all the people whose care and love had moved forward through time and landed here, in this ranch house in Colorado, in this life that was more than she had known to want. "It is perfect," she said. "Good," he said simply, and that was enough. April arrived with mud and warmth, and the creek running fast, and the first green pushing through the brown. And on the 14th of April, which Edna noted was exactly 7 months from the day she had arrived on that noon train, she delivered a son. He was born on a Tuesday, delivered by Doc Waverly from Calico Flats, who had made the ride out in the early morning hours with the professional calm of a man accustomed to being needed urgently. He was healthy and loud about his arrival, which everyone agreed was an excellent sign. He had Simon's coloring and already a particular expression of focused attention that made Dewey, when he saw him, say that this was unmistakably a bishop. Simon held him in the kitchen while Edna rested, and Jessie and Dewey looked at the infant with the particular reverence that hard-working men feel for new life, which is at once practical and completely overwhelming. They named him Thomas James Bishop. Thomas for Thomas Cole, who was by now courting Nora with all proper regularity and her father's cautious blessing, and James for Edna's father, the carpenter. Edna wrote to Florence Hale in St. Louis and to Nora in Denver, both letters on the same day when she had recovered enough to sit at the table, and she told both of them in her careful, specific hand about Thomas James Bishop, 7 pounds and entirely opinionated, who had arrived on the 14th of April in a ranch house in Colorado with the mountains to the west and the plains to the east, and 2 people who loved each other, and him with everything they had. Nora came home for the summer, which was what she called it now, coming home, without any qualifier or hesitation, and she took one look at her brother and held him with the competence of a young woman who had not held many infants and was not going to admit to uncertainty about anything, and the baby looked up at her with the focused bishop attention, and something sealed between them right there in the kitchen doorway that would hold for all the years to come. Thomas Cole came to supper twice that summer, and Simon had 2 more conversations with him that were progressively less uncomfortable, and by August he had asked Simon's permission to formally court Nora with intentions of eventual marriage, and Simon had said yes with the straightforward acceptance of a man who had done his measuring and found the sum satisfactory. Nora, informed of this conversation, said that she would have appreciated being consulted as well, and Edna, laughing, agreed with her completely, and Simon said that he had assumed her interest was established, and Nora said that this was not the point, and the conversation went on for another 20 minutes in the way that conversations with Nora always did, and at the end of it, everyone was in agreement and Thomas Cole remained in the picture, and the evening ended with pie. 2 years passed the way good years do, full and fast and generative, each season building on the last. Thomas James Bishop grew from a loud, opinionated infant into a loud, opinionated toddler with excellent balance and an absolute conviction that all animals were his personal friends, a view the animals seemed broadly to share. He was Simon's shadow in the barn from the time he could walk steadily, and by the time he was 2, he could say horse with perfect clarity and cat with only partial success, and Dewey with a confidence that delighted Dewey enormously. The ranch grew. Simon bought the parcel to the east that had been lying fallow since its original homesteader had given up and gone back to Ohio 3 years prior, and they added the acreage to the cattle operation, and the spring grass was rich enough to run more stock. Edna took over more of the account management formally, and had the books in a condition that Simon said was cleaner than they had been since the ranch's founding, and she also started buying and selling small livestock on her own account with the same practical shrewdness she applied to everything, and within 2 years had added a meaningful contribution to the ranch's income from that side of the operation. She wrote to Nora every week as promised, and Nora wrote back with equal faithfulness, and the letters were full of both the domestic Tommy's latest declarations, the state of the kitchen garden, a particularly fine horse Jessie had acquired, and the larger things, the way the territory was changing, the railroad expanding, the questions of statehood and land rights, and what the next generation of this country would look like. Nora had opinions about all of it, from her position in Denver where she could see the currents of change more clearly, and Edna's opinions in return were formed from the ground up, from the daily specific experience of living on and from and for the land. In the third year after Thomas James was born, Edna was expecting again. She told Simon in the kitchen again on a Tuesday again, because some things become a proper tradition without anyone deciding they will. This time Simon said, "Tuesday," with a satisfaction that was also a smile, and she laughed and said, "Yes, Tuesday," and he pulled her close and held her, and she felt him breathe in the way people breathe when they are full. The second child was a daughter. She arrived in October, small and fierce, and with a look of absolute personal authority, and they named her Margaret Clara Bishop, Margaret for the woman who had built this house and loved this man first, and Clara for the friend who had known what to do with her life at the very end of hers. Simon held Margaret Clara in the kitchen in the October morning light, and he had the open expression, the full one, the one that cost him nothing because all the walls were simply gone. Edna watched him hold his daughter and thought about freight and sorrow, and the way lives are passed forward. And she thought that Clara Whitmore had given her everything she had ever needed when she had asked her to step onto a noon train in September of 1883, wearing someone else's name. She had arrived unknown and afraid, wearing a name that did not fit her, carrying a story that was not quite hers, and she had been known immediately, without explanation, simply and completely known, by a man at a platform who had every reason not to see her and chose to see her anyway. That is the beginning that everything else came from. Every Tuesday conversation and every range ride and every evening at the pine table with its coffee and its lamplight, every biscuit and every letter and every season slow turning on the high Colorado plateau. All of it came from that knowing, that first impossible recognition between two people who had both been through enough loss to know the weight of what they were being given. Nora returned the following Christmas with Thomas Cole, who had completed his own practical education and taken over his father's smithing business, and had come with a ring that he had made himself, which was exactly the right thing for a blacksmith's son to do, and which Nora accepted in the kitchen of the ranch house with her father present and Edna holding Tommy on her hip and Margaret Clara in the cradle that Simon had built for her brother, and then kept, because you keep the things that are made with love. Thomas Cole shook Simon's hand with the grip of a man who has earned the room he stands in, and Simon gripped back and said, "You will be good to her." And Thomas Cole said, "Yes, sir, every day," and that was the full of what needed saying. Edna set Tommy down and went to Nora and took her face in her hands the way Simon had once taken hers, and she looked at the girl who had offered her trust with the wariness and precision of someone protecting something precious, who had said it is useful and then shown, through every season since, what that trust looked like when it was kept. "Are you happy?" Edna asked. "Yes," Nora said, simple and whole and certain. "Then that is everything," Edna said. That Christmas evening, after the children were sleeping, Tommy in his room, Margaret Clara in her cradle, and after Nora and Thomas Cole had retired, and after Dewey and Jessie had gone to the bunkhouse, and after the dishes were done and the fire was banked and the house was still, Simon and Edna sat on the porch. It was cold, a clear cold with the stars enormous above the plains, the Milky Way in full winter splendor, and they had blankets and they sat close enough that the warmth between them was the main source of heat, which was entirely sufficient. The mountains were dark shapes to the west, but they were there, as they always were, permanent and enormous and entirely themselves. "I think about that platform," Simon said. "I think about it too," she said. "The train comes in and there she is," he said, "in a green dress carrying a blue traveling case, and she looks like herself so completely that the name on the letter does not matter at all, because there she is." Edna leaned her head against his shoulder. "I was so afraid," she said, "on that train. The whole ride from St. Louis. I had Clara's name and Clara's correspondence, and I had talked myself into believing I could hold the thing together by sheer will. And then I stepped off the train and I saw a man looking for me at the far end of the platform, and he looked at me before I looked at him, and I thought, that is a man who sees things. "I saw you," he said. "Just that, just exactly you." "I know," she said. "You have been seeing me ever since." He put his arm around her and she settled into his side, and they looked out at the cold and beautiful night above the Bishop Ranch. Above the land they had been working together for coming up on 4 years now. Above the sleeping house, where their children breathed in the warmth they had made for them. She had arrived on the noon train wearing someone else's name, carrying someone else's hope and her own fear in equal measure. And a man at the platform had known her anyway, had known her before she had offered a single word, had given her time and honesty and patience and space, had stood on a porch and lit a pipe by starlight and eventually said the true thing, had built a cradle from his father's memory and hers, had kissed her in a February kitchen and at a church altar and at a September high place above the whole of the Colorado Plateau. She had been known. She had been kept. She had kept him in return and kept this life and given it back to him fuller and warmer than she had found it. The coyote called from the east. Another answered from the north. The stars turned their slow, enormous wheel. "Edna Bishop," Simon said, very quietly, just trying the name the way he still did sometimes, as though testing that it was still real. "Simon Bishop," she said back. He laughed, a low, warm sound, the laugh of a man who has earned his contentment, and she laughed too, and the cold night held them in its wide and patient dark. And in the house behind them the children slept, and the mountains stood in the west as they always had and always would. And this was the full and complete and good life that a noon train and a green dress and one honest man at a platform had set in motion. And it was theirs, entirely and completely and without remainder. Now and through all the years that came after.